and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Today, I am going to share my review of Musketeers versus Cthulhu from Nightfall Games. This is written by Bill Heron, Ben Graybeaton, and Mark Rapson, and it's inspired by the short story written by Claudia Christian and Chris McCauley. Artwork is provided by Bart Winantz, Harry Bottas, and James Churchill. And I do apologize if I somehow mispronounced any of those names. This 112-page hardcover carries an MSRP of approximately $32. Reason why I say approximately is because this is actually from across the pond. But if you want to just grab the PDF alone, you can do so for $15 over at DriveThruRPG. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got Musketeers versus Cthulhu. Few things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, the fine folks over at Nightfall Games were kind enough to provide me with this review copy. But neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. These days, it's important you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I do want to give you a really good feel for what you're going to find inside Musketeers versus Cthulhu. And then, of course, this is a Call of Cthulhu adventure. So if you are a player and your keeper has bought this and just haven't started running it, or maybe they're talking about picking this up, by all means, I certainly recommend tune out now. There are going to be some spoilers. You do not want the surprises of this adventure ruined simply because you are watching this review. Now, of course, if your keeper is thinking about picking this up, let them know about this review so that they can approach Musketeers versus Cthulhu and make a far more informed buying decision. Let's dive in. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take a peek at the credits page. Quite a few people worked very hard to bring this to life, so we will give some credit where credit is due. So as far as this adventure, it is broken up into 4 chapters, takes place in 1626. So, of course, the Musketeers of the title are the Alexandre Dumas Musketeers, and this is set right during that era of his novels. Now, of course, there are options for you to be able to roll up your own Musketeers, so you don't have to necessarily play as the Inseparables. And I will actually share my thoughts about taking this on as the established Musketeers of legend, or if you should be looking at enjoying this adventure with player-created Musketeers. So the premise of this adventure is that the Musketeers come into the proceedings because a young girl has been kidnapped, and the kidnappers demand that her father bring his translation of this ancient text that he's completed. And of course, it doesn't take 3 guesses to understand that, yes, this is a mythos tome, which he has translated. That's why they want this. So the first chapter, the player Musketeers are going to visit this kind of rundown dockside tavern where they're going to meet the father and discuss how they're going to go about making the trade. And they are interrupted by the Cardinal's guards. And of course, if you are familiar with the 3 Musketeers and the 4 Musketeers, then you already know there's animosity between the Cardinal's guards and the King's Musketeers. Now, they don't typically fight to the death because there'd be a lot of murder charges floating around, but they do fight constantly, and that is built into this adventure as well. Funny enough, the Cardinal's guards are not there for the Musketeers. They're there for another reason. They have bigger fish to fry. No pun intended. And the player Musketeers will actually encounter mythos creatures during their escape. So they will quickly realize that there is more to what's going on in Paris than meets the eye. So that'll be the first chapter. Then we have the possibility that the player musketeers will have an audience with Cardinal Richelieu. And I love the fact that throughout this adventure, the player characters have an opportunity to rub elbows with personalities from the Dumas novels. I thought that was very cool. So, of course, we've got the Cardinal. There is an audience with King Louis the 13th. Milady de Winter is in this. So is Rochefort and Captain Cherville of the Musketeers as well. So I love how that is cooked into this adventure too. So the second chapter, the player musketeers are going to go to this manor house, which belongs to, unknown to them, a sorcerer who wants that book. And of course, it's possible that the father is with the musketeers. Probably not, though. And the reality is, as a keeper, I would probably have the father out of the action, just focusing on the musketeers themselves. And I should point out, if you're a keeper who enjoys a more traditional Call of Cthulhu adventure with a minimum of combat and a lot of investigation and uncovering dark secrets, that is not what's taking place in this adventure. This adventure is very combat oriented. And it's important to keep in mind that you're probably going to want to take more of a pulp Cthulhu approach to this adventure as opposed to a traditional Call of Cthulhu approach. Now, honestly, myself personally, I would probably trim a good amount of the combat out of this adventure for my gang because there are a lot of combat encounters that take place throughout this adventure. And I do think that at a certain point, if it's just combat after combat after combat, it starts to feel like a more traditional kind of fantasy role playing game as opposed to a Call of Cthulhu adventure. Now, the second chapter here, while the player musketeers are in this house, there is this spore that's floating all over throughout the air, which will cause the musketeers to hallucinate. Now, these hallucinations can be very deadly, and I would probably only utilize a few of them, some of the creepier ones actually, throughout that chapter, because the way this adventure is written, it is quite possible to have not only a single total party kill, but multiple total party kills. So you might want to adjust things in this adventure if you don't want to be going through multiple parties, having your players rolling up new characters and things like that. Now, between the second and third chapter, the player musketeers are going to have an audience with the king, and the king is aware of this cult of chaos, which is lurking in the shadows of Paris. The cardinal is very familiar with this as well. He's trying to learn more about what their machinations are. And interestingly enough, the cardinal is seeking out various different eldritch sort of tomes and things like that. He has something that's being sent to him from the Vatican. Pretty cool, pretty interesting. So, what'll happen in the third chapter is the player characters are in pursuit of a disgraced member of this cult so that they can learn more about what their plans are, what their sinister plans are. And it takes place in the Paris catacombs. Very cool. I like that a lot. I really dig that this chapter takes place there. Of course, it's the catacombs, so we know we have to have ghouls involved. So we get our final chapter here, and this is where all hell breaks loose in Paris. So the player musketeers will emerge from the catacombs only to find that parts of Paris are in flames. There's fighting in the streets, ghouls engaged in a civil war on the streets, and all the while, the cardinal has had a pair of tablets sent from the Vatican because he thinks that it's something that might be helpful as far as the fight against these cultists. But it turns out the cultists actually want this. They want these tablets. So they're very happy that they're pretty much coming to them. I will say that there is a lot of fighting in the streets that takes place in this chapter. We get some other mythos creatures arrive on the scene that the player musketeers, as well as their fellow musketeers who they have joined with, are fighting across Paris. I would probably trim some stuff out as far as this finale. I will say, I think the finale could have been a little punchier as far as the end game of these cultists, but all in all, solid throughout. And once again, in the fourth chapter, the player musketeers get to rub shoulders with Milady de Winter as well as Rothfort. So I thought that was very cool too. We have some really nice appendices. So we have the first appendices is if you want to create your own musketeers. We also have stat blocks for the four musketeers, or at this point, D'Artagnan's not a musketeer, if I remember correctly. We do have some optional rules as well as new maneuvers. So we have these various different combat maneuvers that the player characters can utilize, and they're very cool. And they do provide a more flamboyant combat than just a standard Call of Cthulhu adventure. So here we've got our player character sheets for the four inseparables. We have our stat blocks for our important NPCs and creatures. We have a couple of new mythos tomes. We even have some random tables for things that are going on in Paris as well. So there's a lot packed into the 112 pages of Musketeers versus Cthulhu from Nightfall Games. All right, we've taken a peek inside the book. Let's swing on over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts as well as my review score. So there's a lot to really like about Musketeers versus Cthulhu. It really is embedded into that fictional historical world of Alexandre Dumas's Musketeers. I love that. I will also point out, though, that there are a lot of historical references that are made throughout this sort of mini campaign that if you are not familiar with this era of French history, you'll probably want to take a peek at, because what's going on with the Huguenots in France is very important to some of the undercurrents of this adventure, because in a lot of ways, the cultist activities are thought to be the Huguenots as opposed to actually being mythos cultists. So I like that, but I do want to point that out that you should have a bit of an idea of what was going on in France around this time. I happen to like how this obviously has a lot of inspiration drawn from Richard Lester's The Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers films. It's so obvious from it, especially when we get into the maneuvers and things like that. As a keeper, if your players have not seen the Three Musketeers or the Four Musketeers, I recommend before they play this, have them watch those movies. It'll give them a far better feel for the vibe of the Musketeers, even if you're not planning on utilizing the fictional characters from Dumas's books. But I definitely love the fact that it's really obvious that this draws inspiration from those Richard Lester films. which in my opinion are the best adaptations of the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers ever put on film. At least that's my opinion. Speaking of Musketeers, I would certainly recommend utilizing player created Musketeers as opposed to utilizing the Four Musketeers of legend. The reason why is I think that your players and yourself as the keeper would have a really good time if they're familiar with the Musketeers, if they have their own player Musketeers, and maybe the Inseparables are friendly rivals of your group of Musketeers. I think that would make for a lot of fun. And remember, they're friendly rivals because they're on the same side. And in the fourth chapter, the player Musketeers actually will meet up with the captain and other Musketeers to do battle with the creatures on the streets, the ghouls and monsters and things like that. So I think it would be a perfect opportunity to actually bring the Four Musketeers into play as NPCs. That way, the player characters get to rub elbows with them, and then those Musketeers race off to take on some other challenge, whereas the player Musketeers continue onward in the adventure to its conclusion. I think that would work out really, really well. And I think your players would enjoy it more having their own Musketeers, creating their own legends, as opposed to just simply playing legendary fictional characters. Once again, just my opinion. I will say, little disappointing that there really isn't any artwork in the book. We do have the various different maps of different locations, which are very well done. But outside of just the cover, this is kind of the only real piece of artwork, which is really nice. I like this piece of artwork. But I would like to have seen a little bit of artwork sprinkled throughout, as opposed to just having the maps of different locations. Do think that this is far too combat oriented, at least in my opinion. And as written, I think there are just far, far too many combat set pieces and combat encounters where it'll start to lose its shine, especially for those out there who play Call of Cthulhu. Most Call of Cthulhu adventures don't have a tenth of the combat that's going on in Musketeers versus Cthulhu. I understand why it's there. Don't get me wrong. I just think it's just far too heavy into the combat for a Call of Cthulhu campaign or mini campaign. Because depending on how long you play each session, I would think you're probably going to get 8 to 10 solid sessions out of what's inside this book. But once again, I would trim out quite a bit of the combat. I would also trim out some of the hallucinations that take place in that sorcerer's house. Also, strangely enough, the girl who's been kidnapped, there's a side plot to that, which really doesn't develop at all. So I'm not sure if it's included simply because of maybe some additional stories or in the planning stages down the line, because I would love to see more adventures for this setting. But we sort of get this side plot with the kidnapped girl, and it really doesn't go anyplace. So, like I said, hopefully that's kind of a sign of more adventures somewhere down the line, but I don't know. All in all, I certainly can recommend Musketeers versus Cthulhu. I had a really good time reading it. I sat here thinking about, oh yeah, I could see my gang. Yeah, oh, yeah, I bet you they would do this. Those kind of things. Once again, I wouldn't run it as written, but I think there's a lot that you could use out of this campaign, and you don't have to tweak that much as far as the storyline and the outcome of the adventure. So, on a scale of 0 to 10, I give Musketeers versus Cthulhu a 7.5 out of 10. I like it. I can recommend it. I would make some tweaks to the adventure, but then again, usually I don't encounter things that I would run as written anyway. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell. Will not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. Central, right here on YouTube. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit gaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find here on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer, and until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.